Welcome, everyone. I'm Thomas Sir, CEO of Kinexum. Today's Kinexum webcast features James Valentine and Larry Bauer, formerly with the FDA and now with food and drug law experts Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, on the importance of early patient and patient group engagement in clinical development. Such practices have arisen out of necessity in rare disease drug development, but are now increasingly important in clinical development generally. A couple of housekeeping points first. James and Larry will be sharing slides as they talk, so if there are folks who are only calling in, it would be best if you could log in. For best sound quality for everyone, please keep your microphone on mute until you have something to say. Also, we have reports of folks who are not able to see the slides on the screen. Try refreshing your screen. Most of us can see it. It's an offer to share from Larry, I think it is. So you need to accept that offer to share, and then you should be able to see the title slide on your screen. Next, if you have questions along the way or at the conclusion of the presentation, please enter it in the chat box that you can open on the right of your screen. Take a look at the right of your screen. There's a vertical strip with various icons. It's the third icon. It kind of looks like a comment or a thought bubble in comics with an ellipse, this ... in it. If you open that up, you can. It's a chat box, and you can enter in your questions, and the speakers will answer as many as we have time for after their presentation. Fourth, a recording of this webcast with slides will be posted, and a link will be distributed to all registrants of this webcast within the next several business days, so you can review it. Or those of you who meant to join us but didn't, we'll find a way to let you know so you can get the benefit of the presentation. And finally, I want to put in a plug for our MedObesity conference in October in Washington, D.C. The stellar speaker roster includes Richard Hodis, Director of the NIH National Institute on Aging, Gary Gibbons, the Director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at NIH, Janet Woodcock, Director of CEDAR at FDA, Susan Main, the Director of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at FDA, and leaders in geroscience, diabetes, cancer, and other chronic diseases, pharma, big nutrition, hot emerging companies, venture capitalists, and other stakeholders. So early bird deadline is August 15. Please check out our kinexum.com website for links to more information. So I'd now like to introduce James and Larry. You have the mic.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad that so many people have joined us on this call this morning. This is Larry Bauer, so you recognize my voice.
And this is James Valentine. Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, so our topic today is catalyzing the transition from bench to bedside, early partnering with patient organizations. So just to give you an overview of what some of the topics we'll be covering today, first we'll talk some general ideas about engaging patient communities. Then we'll talk about the benefits of engaging patients and advocacy groups. Then we'll get down into the weeds a little bit with patient engagement in clinical trials and at what point and how can you engage with patient groups throughout the drug development process. Then we'll talk a little bit about patient input in drug regulation. And then last, we'll talk about the patient-focused drug development initiative, which is a very specific way that patients are being engaged. Okay, so in the overview, I mentioned instead of just saying patients, I used the term patient communities because we're not just talking about the patients themselves, but the patient communities include both the patients, family caregivers, as well as patient advocacy groups and the organizations that represent patients. And one of the overarching statements about why we do this is that patients who live with a disease have a direct stake in the outcome of FDA's decisions and are in a unique position to contribute to the understanding of their disease. So just to talk a little bit about the history of patient engagement, one of the earliest ways that patients were engaged was in the early 1980s when the AIDS epidemic began. AIDS activists demanded that their voices became included in the decision-making for drug development. ACT UP, which was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, back in October of 1988, shut down the FDA's headquarters in Rockville, Maryland, forcing the FDA to pay attention to the special needs of serious and life-threatening diseases. This raised the bar to have the patient at the table with agency decision-making and problem-solving. It also led to the creation of the FDA Office of AIDS Relations, which was the origin of what became the Office of Health and Constituent Affairs. So patients and caregivers understand their disease. Like I said earlier, they are the experts. Patients are uniquely able to describe their symptoms and the impact of these symptoms. And patients and caregivers understand the risks they're willing to take to use a new treatment and how to be involved in decisions about that risk-benefit analysis. And patients want to participate in the development of products that they eventually will be taking. So patient groups provide unique value to research partners. They can help to de-risk early stage development with funding and public-private partnerships for basic, translational, and early clinical research. They can also help reduce uncertainty in the regulatory process by working closely with the regulators through the entire research and development process. A while back, Janet Woodcock gave a speech called The Roadmap to Patient Advocacy. In this speech, she focused on the need for patient groups to engage with researchers and pharmaceutical companies early in the process, not just when they get to the FDA. Sometimes by the time something has gotten to the FDA, it's too late to engage the patients as meaningfully as they could have been. So there'll be more information about this and the ways that we do this on the slides to follow. So patients can help to develop more effective, efficient trials with a greater chance of success by asking better questions and having input into the study design. They contribute to efficient recruitment and improved retention in the study. Their involvement may lead to having fewer protocol amendments or needs to make changes to the protocol once it's been designed. They will help create procedures that are better suited to the patient. And they help us develop clinical endpoints that are well grounded in the natural history of the disease and the understanding of that disease progression. And some of the potential benefits that are most important to the patient can only be identified by the patients. So they help contribute to more patient-relevant research findings overall. The next slide, there's a lot of details in this slide, but it's okay. I just wanted to give you an overview. I'm going to give some details about each one of these boxes to follow. But this slide helps to show that patient group engagement across the clinical trial continuum, going from left to right, from pre-discovery through phase 1, 2, and 3, all the way up to FDA approval. These best practices in this chart came from a multi-stakeholder project that was convened by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is an FDA private-public partnership. So this is the first box on the bottom left of the first slide. This is the pre-discovery period. So even before any preclinical work, when you're thinking about possibly a new product or exploring treatments for a specific disease, engaging with patients can help explore in the interest of the research question and get input from the patient community about that. They can help provide data on what are the unmet needs in their disease and what's the therapeutic burden. They can also help direct funding and fundraising for research or product development. This can vary from group to group. Some patient organizations are in early stages, but some of the more advanced, even rare disease groups, have large funding capacities to be able to get involved in product development. And patients can also help understand the mechanism of action relevant to the disease and the symptom burden. And then they can also begin developing animal models of the disease. And this is of specific interest to patient advocacy groups because when they do develop an animal model, that animal model can be used for a variety of products. So if several companies are developing products for their disease, the animal model can be used across programs. Secondly, in the preclinical phase, once again, they can continue to help with funding and fundraising for the research. The patient organizations are often the ones doing natural history studies, and they are the ones that often have control of the natural history database as well as registries. They can help explore the possibility of having an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, which is a way of engaging patients and gathering information that we'll go into a little bit later in the talk. They can give feedback on meaningful clinical endpoints. They can assist with creating informed consent documents and helping to maybe clearly identify what should be inclusion and exclusion criteria that aren't too restrictive. They can advise on study recruitment, and they can also accompany the sponsor to FDA meetings to advocate for study design and endpoints. Then we move to the phase 1 clinical studies and how can patients engage at this point. So patients can help with recruitment and outreach. They're excellent in helping to get the word out about what studies are available to their patient communities, often using their websites and tweets and other forms of social media. They can help with funding and funding research. Sometimes they can help with infrastructure support. They can provide input on study design, especially identifying barriers to participation. So is there something in the study design that might actually prevent people from getting involved? They can help define eligibility criteria within the study protocol. They can support trial awareness and recruitment efforts. And they can peer advocate during informed consent procedures. And then moving into the phase 2-3 clinical studies, once again, they can continue to help with funding and fundraising. They can help to network for recruitment and outreach. And I have seen the engagement of patient advocacy groups for recruitment as being a real game changer. Sometimes when a company is developing a drug for a rare disease, the thing that slows down the progress of that development the most is recruitment. And I've seen engagement with the patient group completely turn around the recruitment from having like almost no patients to the full recruitment for the study. Patients can also serve on data safety monitoring boards to help monitor safety signals. They can report on patient feedback regarding sites, investigators, and study experience along the way. So as a trial is in progress, they can offer feedback about how the trial is going. Does anything need to be changed? And they can serve in preference studies for benefit risk assessment. And then finally, in the FDA review and approval process, patients are often served, they often serve on FDA advisory committees. They provide testimony at FDA hearings, both formally as well as during like the open public mic period of the advisory committee. They can give feedback on meaningful endpoints, and when you're presenting to the FDA, they can give feedback on why the endpoint that was chosen actually is meaningful to their disease. And they can participate in disease-specific meetings at the FDA. And for research priority setting, patient input has a vital role at the very early stages of drug development. They can ensure that research priorities align with the patient needs, and they can ensure the relevance of the outcomes. So before a drug developer gets too far down the line, if they're developing something that actually is not going to be useful to the patients, the patient feedback can help with that to more clearly focus on relevant outcomes. And involving patients will help to ensure that development of novel therapies is focused on areas of patient care that require improvement as defined by the patients themselves. In other words, is a drug addressing an unmet medical need? The experiential knowledge that patients can bring to priority setting adds value. For example, in assessing whether the potential benefit of the proposed intervention is commensurate with the level of commitment and resources expected from all stakeholders, including patient participants and funders. To continue with research design and planning, patient input in protocol design can help identify acceptable comparators. For example, the standard of care versus placebo. Oftentimes patient groups have a lot of input onto, whether they will tolerate a placebo arm in the study or whether they want, the drug developer to come up with an alternative study design, maybe a crossover design. They give feedback on relative endpoints. For example, treatment-free, progression-free, or overall survival, like what's important to them. They can help identify acceptable risks versus potential benefits from the patient perspective. So how much risk are they willing to take in a study for the, when there's a prospect of benefit for them? How much risk are they willing to tolerate and, can be written into the study? They also have input into the relevant target population for the disease. And patients can help to identify appropriate inclusion and exclusion criteria. This can help prevent exclusion of those at greatest need or those that are most likely to benefit from the intervention from participating in clinical trials. What's often seen is that sometimes a researcher they think that they're doing the best thing by coming up with these restrictive inclusion criteria, but actually the patients that will eventually be using the drug maybe are a much broader population and actually should be included in the study. And patients can also facilitate selection of relevant patient-centered outcomes, including patient-reported outcome measures. These are outcome measures that are directly recording feedback and assessment of patients' perception of their symptoms and disease effects. Patient input can help in identifying potential issues, such as data protection. Do they have any issues about how the data is going to be used? Sometimes this especially is relevant in genetic studies or gene therapies when someone, there's a requirement to have genetic testing, but then the patient's very concerned about how that genetic data is going to be protected or who might it be shared with in the future. It provides adequate assurance that patient concerns are addressed early in the trial design and do not become barriers to trial participation. We don't want to have anything that's going to cut down on recruitment for the study or exclude anyone from the study. Also, to assess operational factors, for example, the frequency of the visits, how often are the patients going to be required to come to clinic? Is that, a baseline and then once a week, once a month, once every 6 months? The availability of remote monitoring. So do they have to always come to clinic, or are there opportunities where maybe an assessment could be completed online or something mailed in, or maybe there's an assessment that can be done over the telephone? And these kind of things can really impact the ability or willingness of patients to take part in trials. Also, securing patient advice for communications around trials can ensure clarity of materials. For example, patient information leaflets and consent forms. If if there's several patient groups several patients that are asked to maybe review these materials before they're used widely, you might get, important feedback from the patients about, their ability to understand the content, about something that should be included, those types of things. Patients are also best placed to identify practical considerations that reflect the diversity of the patient population and their differing situations. This might include the need for travel expenses or support for family members. If you're trying to get wide participation, there might be people from other parts of the country or people in different economic brackets that actually need assistance if they're going to participate in the study. It may even involve exploring the possibility of clinicians going to the home. Depending upon, some patients have mobility issues or issues with travel. It might actually be cheaper and more efficient to send a nurse or a physician, out to the patient to collect data. And there might be special needs in the patient community in general related to mobility issues or fatigue that have to be taken into consideration when designing the research study. So patients can also contribute to securing funding for research. For example, by identifying novel research topics. And in terms of ethics, patients can aid in evaluating the relevance of a study to the proposed target population, that study design and its potential to deliver meaningful outcomes that are meaningful to the patients. They can give feedback in the conduct of the study to make sure that the study is conducted in a way that is sensitive to the needs of participants. And then any time that there's going to be the enrollment of children, there will need to be ethical evaluation of the prospect of direct clinical benefit for the children before that study can proceed. Patient representatives can become members of the trial steering committees and participants at investigator meetings, and they can anticipate, for example, trial recruitment challenges or opportunities, potentially highlighting areas of concern to trigger protocol amendments. And when protocol changes are implemented, patients provide input in communicating what these changes are and why they have been made, especially if these types of changes are resulting from new safety information and the study is having to be modified because of some safety signal that has emerged during the study. Patients can work with data monitoring committees, and patient input can help to evaluate the impact of study results on real patients and facilitate assessment of side effects, identify underlying issues related to formulation and administration, adherence, and study retention and dropouts. For instance, sometimes there's a product might be developed that has one route of administration, and patients might give feedback that actually that's either intolerable or they would prefer another route of administration that, for instance, getting frequent injections or frequent IV therapy, they might have input on ways to modify the route of administration. And patient input aids communication of results and their relevance to the wider patient community. The patients definitely do talk to each other, and both formally and informally on their websites and in their online different forums that they have. So some of the recommendations for all stakeholders to optimize success are: 1, to engage the patient voice by establishing partnerships from the beginning of the research and development program to improve trial design and execution. Secondly, to clearly define the expectations, roles, and responsibilities of all the partners, including the resources being committed, data being shared, and objectives of the development program. And along with this clarity is to have these things in writing, these agreements, to have them very clearly and transparently established and documented. Thirdly, to build the trust required for successful partnerships by being transparent and trustworthy, following through on commitments, and honoring confidentiality. Fourth is to involve the expertise of multiple partners for a broader perspective to mitigate risk and enrich pipeline development. And number 5 is to manage real or perceived conflicts of interest by establishing policies that require full disclosure, transparency, and accountability. So some of the best practices continued is to include the patient input from the very beginning. We've talked about that since the start of this talk. And when engaging the patient community, be sure to include a wide range of patients from different backgrounds and different phenotypes of the disease, as well as possibly including some diseases have several different advocacy groups, and it's good to engage all the groups whenever possible. And include patients that are newly diagnosed as well as those in late stages of the disease. treatment, medications might have different effects on people at different stages of the disease, and it's important to involve people at all stages so that when it's eventually the drug is labeled, that you have information and data about how the drug affects all people. Engage with patient advocacy organizations and try to be inclusive if there's several organizations with the same disease, and be transparent in how you engage with patient groups and patient representatives. A little bit about patient input in drug regulation. So the FDA reviews medical products on a case-by-case basis when it receives an application. Patients and caregivers can contribute to FDA's regulatory decision-making mainly in two different ways. They can consult and advise on specific applications. So this is through the patient representative program at the FDA, as well as participating in open public hearings at FDA Advisory Committee meetings. And then they can provide also more general context that's applicable to all applications. So this includes patient-focused drug development meetings, listening sessions with the FDA, participating in those and giving testimony at those, and participating in disease-specific FDA meetings and workshops. So when thinking about working with the FDA, I'll talk a little bit about who are the FDA players. So there are certain parts of the FDA that are more patient liaison focused. One group is it's the fairly new patient affairs staff with Andrea Furrier-Helms that's in the Office of the Commissioner. There's also the stakeholder engagement staff. And then we have the CDER professional affairs and stakeholder engagement that's involved in patient engagement, but specifically with CDER regulated products. And some of the other offices at the FDA involved are the Office of Orphan Products Development. That office not only engages in reviewing orphan designation and rare pediatric disease designation and humanitarian use devices, but they also do a lot of work engaging with the patient communities. And that also specifically to CDER is the CDER Rare Diseases Program, whose mission is solely to help expedite development of products for people with rare diseases. And part of their mission is to work with patient groups, to engage them, get feedback from them, and to represent them during the reviews of products with, rare disease products at FDA and CDER. And then there's the CDER Office of Strategic Programs. And then within the specific review divisions, the review division staff are also frequently engaged with the patient voice. Moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of patient engagement at the FDA. This slide has some small writing, but you can see on the far left is in the 1980s with the HIV/AIDS patient group that I mentioned earlier. This is the evolution of patient engagement has grown over time. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative from 2012 and up to the future, where we have most recently the FDA Patient Affairs staff, which is established memorandum of understanding with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. And I see a question about where's the Patient Affairs staff located. The Patient Affairs staff is located in the Office of the Commissioner, and if you Google that, Patient Affairs staff site equals FDA.gov, you'll probably get a direct link to contacting them. I'll talk now a little bit about one specific program, the Patient Representative Program. This program began in the 1990s. It kind of was an outcome of the early involvement with the AIDS community and the ACT UP group. Patients and primary caregivers are having an active role at the FDA advisory committees and consultations with review divisions. It's a training program for specific patients with specific diseases, and currently there's approximately 201 representatives that represent 300 plus conditions of diseases. And these patients are engaged in approximately 60 different assignments a year across the agency whenever something's in development and their expertise is required. And they are managed by the Advisory Committee oversight and management staff. Another important way that, one of the newer ways that patients are being engaged is in FDA Listening Sessions. These are meetings that are ad hoc meetings to help inform the FDA staff of disease and treatment burden in a particular disease, and it can have either a broad or narrow focus. They can be related to a drug, biologic, device specific, or they can be cross-center. Oftentimes, if it's a general meeting for a disease, they will try to include people across, staff from FDA from all the centers that might see products related to that disease. And these types of meetings, they're requested by the FDA central point of entry for inquiries and meetings, which is the patient affairs staff, which we just had the question about, that's located in the Office of the Commissioner. And during these meetings, they're listening, they tend to be listening sessions for the FDA staff to learn and to hear from patients directly about their condition. Talk now a little bit about the 21st Century Cures Act, which was a law signed into effect December 13th, 2016. It requires the FDA to make public a brief statement regarding the patient experience data and the related information, if any, submitted and reviewed as part of an approved NDA or BLA. So this might include the following information: data that are collected to provide information about the patient's experience with the disease or condition, including related to the impact of the disease on patients' lives and patients' preferences with respect to the treatment. Any information on patient-focused drug development tools, for example, patient-reported outcome measures, and other information that FDA determines to be relevant. So prior to the enactment of the 21st Century Cures, sometimes patient data was included, but now it's actually become a requirement that there's a statement talking about how patient experience data was in part of the NDA or BLA review. Now we'll move on to understanding the patient perspective from the patient-focused drug development meetings. So the assessment of a drug's benefits and risks involves analysis of the severity of the condition and the current state of the treatment armamentarium. Patients who live with the disease, they have a direct stake in drug review process, and they're in a unique position to contribute to drug development. So patient inputs, it's generally relied on feedback received at advisory committees. Now with the patient-focused drug development, there's benefits from broader and more systematically collected patient perspectives on their disease severity and unmet medical need by therapeutic or disease area. So this patient-focused drug development initiative started with PDUFA 5. It included dedicated resources to expand activities to provide review divisions with patient input. So to begin the process, FDA convened 24 meetings with stakeholders focused on specific disease areas. They conducted about 4 public workshops a year. Each meeting featured a different disease area, reviewing available treatments for that indication and identifying areas of unmet need. Participants included FDA review staff, the relevant patient advocacy community, and other interested parties. So sometimes there were people from the pharmaceutical industry, there were researchers came, and some clinicians came to attend to learn about the disease. And FDA had a seat at the table at these meetings, but they were primarily in listening mode, and they also asked clarifying questions at the meetings. And the outcome of these were usually day-long meetings, and at the end of the meeting, a voice of the patient report was written to help capture everything that was discussed, from direct quotes from the patients, the topics that were covered, and any other thing that was learned from the meeting. So the topics at each of these patient-focused drug development meetings included, first, what is it like to live with that specific condition? So these are some of the questions that were asked at all of the meetings, and it was done consistently so that there would be a consistent way that the FDA gathered this information. But the first question asked was, of all the symptoms that you experience because of your condition, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your life? And then are there specific activities that are important to you but that you cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of your condition? So how is the disease impacting your life? And how do your symptoms and their negative impacts affect your daily life on the best days and then again on the worst days? And has your condition and its symptoms changed over time? So what's been the evolution of your disease? Do the symptoms come and go? If so, do you know of anything that makes your symptoms better or worse? And then finally, what worries you the most about your condition? The second topic of the patient-focused drug development meetings were, what are the approaches that people are using to treat their condition? What are you currently doing to help treat your condition or its symptoms? For example, this could include prescription medicines, over-the-counter products, and other therapies, including non-drug therapies such as exercise, massage therapy, acupuncture, those kinds of things. And how has your treatment regimen changed over time and why? And how well does your current treatment regimen, so all the things that you're using today, how does it treat the most significant symptoms of your disease? How well do the treatments improve your ability to do specific activities that are important to you in your daily life? And what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect your daily life? For example, are there bothersome side effects? Do you have to go to the hospital for treatment, or are there restrictions on your driving, for example? And what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for your condition? So even if the disease couldn't be cured, what would you like to see in a treatment? So as I mentioned, the FDA conducted 24 of these meetings, but there was no way for this process to continue. There was some wonderful learning, and these meetings had a great outcome, but the process needed to continue. For rare diseases, there's over 7,000 diseases, and how do you continue to gather this type of patient-level information? So something was initiated called an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. CDER announced this in 2015. These externally led meetings would use the same framework as the FDA-led meetings. And as of March 2019, there have been so far about 25 of these externally led meetings. And the way that they're usually initiated by a patient group, and the first step in setting up one of these meetings is to submit a letter of intent to the FDA with proposing that you'd like to have an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for your disease. The meetings are often held in Washington, D.C., so that the FDA review division staff can attend, which is very important for these meetings. And once again, like they did at the FDA meetings, at the end, a voice of the patient report is written up and posted publicly so that anyone who wants can have access to the results of the meeting. So these externally led meetings have minimal FDA involvement, so they need a lot of preparation time, away from the FDA. This is a list of about 25 of the meetings that have been held externally in some of the disease groups. I just wanted to let you know that James Valentine, who you'll be hearing from in a second, has been very involved in helping set up these meetings and has been involved in either setting them up, moderating, or helping get these going in about 2/3 of all the externally led meetings that have been conducted so far. So some of the considerations for having an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting are, is it for a disease area that's chronic, symptomatic, or affects functioning and activities of daily living? Is it a disease area for which aspects of the disease are not formally captured in clinical trials? Is it a disease area for which there currently are no therapies or very few therapies, or the available therapies do not directly affect how a patient feels, functions, or survives? And is it for a disease that has a severe impact on identifiable subpopulations such as children or the elderly? So I'm going to turn it over to James now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the patient voice and some specific examples.
Great. Thank you, Larry, and thank you all for sticking with us. I know we covered a lot of ground, both on some best practices for researchers and developers to engage with patients as they're designing and working through their development program, and then talked about the value of the patient voice in regulatory decision-making, specifically talking about the FDA. I appreciate someone that's on the webinar, Dean, for mentioning that the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command medical research programs have been engaging with patients for quite some time, and there are many different federal agencies. I know the National Institutes of Health also has a program for involving patients as reviewers on research RFPs there as well. So lots of great examples that exist out there that are more reason for those of you that are on as whether you're an academic investigator and researcher or you're with a biotech or pharma company, to look to those government agencies as examples. We wanted to provide you just with a handful of some examples just to show you that where really the value of the patient voice has come into play and helped change perhaps the course of a particular development program. The first one that we have here is in Pompe disease, and this is an example where an FDA patient representative helped influence the course of development for Myozyme, a product that was under review at the FDA for the treatment of Pompe disease. And Miss Tiffany House, who's pictured here on the slide, is both a Pompe patient and advocate, very involved in her patient community. She was in an interesting situation where she actually served as a consultant to the review division, and then ultimately went on to then serve as an ad hoc member of the advisory committee that was reviewing Myozyme. So during review, she was meeting with the FDA regulators, giving the patient input as they were reacting to proposed trial designs, reacting to clinical trial data as it came in, and then ultimately also served on that advisory committee, which Larry talked about. And interestingly, during that advisory committee, the lead FDA medical reviewer stated how she had learned from Tiffany that being stable for a person with a uniformly progressive disease is a huge benefit. And with now kind of with the number of different products that are being developed and have been reviewed for different progressive neuromuscular diseases, this might seem obvious to us. But back during the review of Myozyme, this was actually a profound, important understanding that treatment benefit didn't necessarily mean improvement, but actually slowing or stopping progression could be important. And so the FDA medical reviewer asked the advisory committee members to account for this in assessing the clinically meaningfulness of the results. So essentially, kind of the analogy of a judge giving a jury instructions for how to interpret the law, the FDA medical reviewer asked the advisory committee members to apply what a patient said would be important, not perhaps their own subjective ideas of what that might be. Another example here that I think is useful because it's a little earlier in development, and this is a blog post that I had written about this example pictured, but was in Prader-Willi syndrome. And so this is a disease that's characterized by the psychiatric hyperphagia, so an uncontrollable desire to eat. And this drug development programs for Prader-Willi, because this uncontrolled eating, one of the manifestations of that is obesity, had been regulated by FDA in the GI division, where they really understood obesity and obesity-related outcomes. However, when you would poll patients, they all would say, that hyperphagia was their primary burden. Not only was it resulting in obesity, but it would result in choking events. I mean, a patient that would see, perhaps a pumpkin on the stoop would not be able to control themselves from, eating that entire pumpkin, gorging themselves, potentially choking, or even rupturing their stomach. So there's a lot of other consequences of this disease that results in these patients essentially needing to be in controlled environments. And so, it wasn't until the patient community went before the FDA and helped the GI division understand that hyperphagia was important and that should be measured at least as equally as obesity, even if that's what that particular review division is most comfortable with. And it wasn't until the patient community did this that the GI division changed the advice it was giving to companies, now allowing them to use hyperphagia as a co-primary endpoint. And actually down the road, this Prader-Willi programs are actually now regulated under the Division of Psychiatry Products, where it's probably the more appropriate place. So an important way that patients help influence clinical trial endpoint selection, both with the companies and with the FDA. So a third example to share with you is in Duchenne Muscular dystrophy. So this was an interesting one where during the review and ultimately the approval of a drug called eteplirsen for Duchenne, there's a patient group called the Jet Foundation that after some interactions with FDA, where they were communicating to the agency that they were hearing reports of the patients that were participating in the clinical trial for that drug, that they were gaining the ability to do things that they had lost the ability to do, given the nature of the progression of this neuromuscular condition. And so, FDA recognizing that those types of activities, like being able to open a food container again, or stopping the number of daily spontaneous collapses that were happening, things like that were not being captured in the clinical trial itself, asked the patient community to go out and see if they could collect some information on this, whether it be before and after videos that parents might have been taking of these boys with Duchenne, or other types of documentation. And so the Jet Foundation went out and actually did this, and this was outside of the clinical trial itself. And when Jet Foundation took this to FDA, they said that they would take these patient experiences into account in the review of the application. Ultimately, the head of the Jet Foundation, Christine McSherry, was the first ever patient advocate to present during the core presentation at an advisory committee, not just during the open public hearing portion. And so this project also helped influence the thinking and decision making by the advisory committee members. Perhaps to me, what is the most important lesson learned here was not that the patient voice can and patient experiences can help inform an understanding of the product that is being developed and tested, but that had patients been engaged early on, these things that were being seen were often the things that patients described as their pain points. And if sponsors, perhaps had asked patients about their pain points and included those as endpoints, perhaps more of this could have been included prospectively as part of the clinical trial. And actually what you see now is many of the clinical trials in Duchenne are now capturing many of the things that patients had pointed out during this experience. And one final example to leave you with, in a completely different disease area, Epidermolysis Bullosa. This is a rare skin condition. The underlying genetic cause causes the skin to essentially not be able to stay attached, and it results in chronic, painful, extremely painful wounds all over the bodies of people and a lot of children affected with this. And so this disease community actually requested and partnered with FDA to host one of those externally led patient-focused drug development meetings to help FDA understand that some of the traditional endpoints that were being used in dermatology were not representative of what would be clinically meaningful to an EB patient. And so FDA agreed that that perhaps what they had been using weren't the best option. So they wanted to hear from patients and really learn from them about what would be important. And so here you see a quote from the division director from the Division of Dermatology Products within the Center for Drugs at FDA, where she says, "No one knows this disease better than all of you. What can we do to increase the chances of a trial being able to demonstrate success if the product works? How can we change these trials? What can we do to increase the chances of success?" I think that's something for all of us to go home and think about. I will certainly be putting some thought into it. And so what ultimately happened was FDA did put some thought into it. And just 2 months after that patient-focused drug development meeting, FDA put out a draft guidance document on the development of drugs for epidermolysis bullosa. And you can see in there they opened up their thinking around what could be considered as an efficacy endpoint, and did not limit it to the traditional outcome measures used in dermatology. For example, the investigator global assessment of skin quality. So another way that really the patient voice has informed regulatory decisions. So again, we covered a lot of ground, a lot of information, and we thank you for sticking with us through that. I know we have some questions coming in, and so Larry and I are happy to address those. Please feel free to submit your comment to the chat if you'd like us to answer any questions.
So the first question, someone asked whether the patient representative contributed to the decision, the ultimate decision. I think that was for the approval of Epidermolysis is when this question showed up. And do you think the FDA arrived at the right decision? As probably many people know, that was a very tough decision. And I think that the testimony from the patient group absolutely was what affected the decision. As you know, the data, sometimes in rare diseases, sometimes it's hard to recruit large numbers of patients. The data was kind of on the line, and Dr. Woodcock eventually made the final decision, and I believe that her decision was based on the fact that it was for a rare disease, that there are no approved treatments for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and that the patients did report seeing an effect. So I think in that particular case, it was critical. And
so just to add one piece of color, I think the statements of the advisory committee members themselves answer that question. So the advisory committee members were asked whether the trial data supported approval. And, in their vote, and what I was always told when I was at FDA was what the advisory committee members say in explaining their votes is actually more important than the vote itself. And what the advisory committee members said was in answering the very specific questions that FDA was asking them, about, whether the amount of the surrogate biomarker, the dystrophin, was reasonably likely to predict ultimate clinical benefit, answering these questions that, the votes were actually negative in supporting the approval of the drug. However, they said if I was being asked a different question and could actually account for the patient testimony as part of the evidence, I might have a different vote. So I think it did, I think on its face, it did contribute to people believing that the drug was helping patients. So next question, Larry.
Okay, the next question came from Tom. It says, James, as an example, I heard at DIA, it was for an indication I don't recall, but where the patient input revealed that control of diarrhea was a huge point in patients' quality of life. This dimension had never occurred to the drug developer. Are these early patient group engagement principles? Oh, okay, I think that was that the end of that, or is that a continuation? Are these early patient group engagement principles mainly applicable to rare diseases? Okay, that's separate. Let's answer this first one about diarrhea as a...
Yeah, so I think they might be related, and I think the point here is that often when designing clinical trials, one of the first things that a researcher or a drug developer will do is go out to the key opinion leaders in the space, and many of you on the phone may yourself be key opinion leaders. And what I've seen is there tends to be a bias towards measuring the things that we've always measured. in a disease, and that might be, somewhat based off of what is feasible and practical to do in a clinical setting, and what are thought to be the best clinical measures of understanding disease severity, disease burden. What are the prognostic, things that we can actually measure. What we've seen is this general move towards looking more holistically at, how are these symptoms and health effects that patients are experiencing, not just the things that can be measured in the clinic, but perhaps other aspects of how patients feel and function. What are the ones that are most impacting them in day-to-day life? And then if we can't measure that in a clinic, is there a way to develop a patient-reported outcome or something else to measure it? So sometimes the things that are really important to measure aren't the things that, may have been, the low-hanging fruit of what's important. And I think that could be I don't know the specific example, but that could be what was the case where diarrhea, perhaps maybe not, what is the definition of the disease, might not include diarrhea or GI issues, but many diseases actually do have GI issues, that are important part of the constellation of symptoms and impacts.
Yeah, when I was at the FDA, I participated in almost all of the rare disease patient-focused drug development meetings, and oftentimes these meetings were for rare diseases were the first time that so many people with that rare disease had all gotten together to meet. And almost at every single meeting, there were aha moments where when you heard from numerous people, you polled people from all over the country with a certain rare disease, something emerged that was unexpected, sometimes for the patients themselves and sometimes for the clinicians that were present at the meeting, and said, like, oh, I never realized how important that was to patients.
So then the second part of your question was about whether these are mainly applicable to rare diseases, or have we seen instances in common diseases where there's been benefit. I think kind of some of the groundbreaking examples have really been in rare diseases, and I think a lot of that is because so much less is known in a rare disease relative to a common disease. That's partially because, in common diseases, there's a lot more basic science research that is done relative to rare diseases, so there's a lot greater scientific understanding of the condition itself. And then, of course, there tends to many of the development programs are the first ever in a particular disease, whereas in many, many common diseases, we have lots of clinical trial experience that we can look to help understand, what is important to measure, where were there gaps, what are the lessons learned from other programs. That being said, just because in common diseases maybe there are more treatment options and more is known, there's always tends to be this shifting burden of the disease is what I've seen. So, think about, major depressive disorder, and we have lots of medicines for depression, very common disease. Well, just because we have some medicines for depression, I don't think the depression community would say that their disease is now cured. And so it's really important to talk and understand from patients in common diseases how well what is available is working, and not only what are the gaps and what's needed to be addressed in terms of symptoms, but a lot of, all drugs come with trade-offs. And so it's also understanding what trade-offs, what side effects are actually most burdensome to patients, leading them to either not take drugs or not be as compliant in taking drugs, or just, what's really reducing their quality of life. So that way, even if a future drug is maybe equally as effective as an existing therapy, perhaps it can help avoid some of the most burdensome downsides of existing treatments.
And then also for some drugs, there's certain subgroups within that patient population that don't respond to a treatment. So then, even though there's maybe 75% of the people respond to a certain treatment, there's still this untreated group of people that still are looking for a treatment.
Right. Well, I think it's also part of the general trend toward patient centricity. That's, I don't know whether it's the last 10 or 20 years, but it's relatively recent. And the extent to which you get patient engagement, even for common diseases, seems like there are applicable principles across all patient groups. We've kind of been going at this for a little bit over an hour now. I think maybe we can say that I think I found the presentation and the Q&A to be very helpful. This webcast, again, will be posted and links distributed by early next week. For those of you who signed up for this as opposed to just called in, you'll be notified when that happens. Otherwise, please check Kinexum.com and for when these are posted. With that, we thank James and Larry for this terrific session and for your attendance and discussion, and wish all of you a good day and a great weekend. Thank you so much.